When a classy, powerful black businesswoman was mocked and disdained by a smug airport employee in front of a line of strangers, no one expected what would happen next. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. They thought they could erase her dignity with a smirk and a change of seat. But what they didn't know was that she was more than just a passenger. She was a storm they never saw coming, and before the day was out, careers would crumble, systems would collapse, and justice would be served in silence. Stay until the end to see how one woman turned a quiet humiliation into a massacre that shook an entire industry. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It's a powerful testament to the quiet strength and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If you're new here, I warmly invite you to share in the comments below wherever you're watching. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon. We're sharing voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now on to the story. The early morning light filtered through the glass panes of Los Angeles International Airport, casting an ethereal, almost deceptively calm light across the bustling terminal. Naomi Sinclair stood at the threshold of Gate 24. Her figure was a silhouette of understated elegance against the awakening chaos of travelers rushing to connecting flights, the echoing announcements and the soft hum of luggage wheels scraping the polished floor. Her grip on the handle of her rich red mahogany suitcase tightened, as if she were bracing herself against the familiar weight of movement. She was no stranger to the scene. Over the years, Naomi had been through countless airports on every continent, each with its own hidden power plays and silent judgments. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air, a static that raised the invisible hairs on her skin. Dressed to perfection in a tailored midnight blue coat, with a silk scarf that shimmered with the subtle shimmer of an inheritance, she looked like the seasoned executive she was until she opened her mouth. The moment her smooth, softly accented voice asked the gate agent for confirmation of boarding, something changed. The woman behind the counter, Chloe Patterson, as her name tag indicated with corporate precision, let out a wordless laugh, a sound not of amusement, but of something far colder. It was a laugh that slid between politeness and malice, a scalpel disguised as a smile. Chloe's eyes, quick and appraising, slid over Naomi's face, her skin, her studied grace. "You have quite an interesting accent," Chloe said, her tone light but underscored by an unspoken condescension. She didn't wait for Naomi to respond. A subtle ripple passed through the nearby staff, whispered chuckles exchanged, half hidden behind tight gestures, as if a decision had already been made before Naomi stepped forward. "There has been a change to your seat," Chloe continued, her fingers typing on the keyboard with mock concern. "It appears you have been upgraded to economy, seat 44E. Naomi felt her pulse slow, not with panic but with a creeping, bone-deep understanding. "I booked 2A, she said quietly, her tone calm, not rising to meet the sudden storm. Chloe's smile deepened. Sometimes the system corrects itself. Perhaps there had been a booking error. Happens more often than you think. The words were wrapped in a well-practiced customer service script, but the malice was clear, hidden beneath the layer of professionalism. The passengers in line behind Naomi shifted, some craning their necks to watch, others sighing in anticipation. A few muttered about the delay, casting at Naomi the fleeting disdain reserved for those who dared to disrupt the smooth running of travel. She felt her hands go cold, not from fear but from clarity. This was no accident. This was not about the location. This was about a decision made in an instant, a calculation of value made not from records or a reservation, but from the color of her skin, the shape of her words. As Chloe turned to greet the next passenger, a man in cargo shorts, a crumpled boarding pass in his hand, whose approach was met with cheerful, interrogative efficiency, Naomi's gaze remained fixed on her. In that moment, she realized something far more insidious than outright rejection. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rude. It was systematic, seamless. A faint, almost imperceptible shudder ran through Naomi's chest, a mixture of quiet anger and piercing understanding. She sat up straighter, the weight of her own history in every slight every sidelong glance she'd ever endured pressing against her spine like a shield. Her voice, when it came, was low and clear. "May I speak to your supervisor?" Chloe's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tight at the edges. She tapped her earpiece, relaying the message to someone with the exaggerated patience of a retail worker dealing with a perceived problem. Naomi's request was met with a delay, an orchestrated indifference, as if the simple act of acknowledging her complaint was an inconvenience too much to bear. The minutes dragged on. The line behind her grew restless. It was only when a junior employee, Lucas, approached, his name whispered between badges, that Naomi caught a glimmer of something like guilt in his expression. His voice was barely above a whisper, but Naomi caught every word. "They don't want you in first class," he said. "It doesn't fit with the brand image. Better to have you somewhere less visible." For a moment, Naomi's breath caught in her throat, her mind processing the quiet confession, but her face gave nothing away. Not yet. She nodded her agreement, her silence sharper than any protest. It was a silence born not of resignation, but of calculation, a gathering storm that no one in this terminal, with their quiet chuckles and forced smiles, sensed coming. As she stood there waiting, Naomi's phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She glanced at it, the prearranged signal from her executive assistant. A single word lit the screen. "Done." The corner of her mouth twitched invisibly, not into a smile but a thin line of determination. She knew that what was happening was more than just a personal humiliation. It was a mirror, reflecting the quiet rot beneath the polished corporate facades. And as the terminal around her hummed with the ignorant rhythms of everyday travel, as announcements called for groups to board, and the staff at the desk waved away her presence as a nuisance best ignored, Naomi felt the air shift. It was subtle, a ripple before the wave, but it was there. The storm had begun not with shouts or accusations, but with a look, a sneer, and an understatement from a woman who knew all too well how the world had tried to erase her quietly, efficiently, and with a smile. By the time her name was called as an addendum, a final check on the manifest, Naomi had already decided there would be no confrontation. Not here, not now. But the reckoning had begun, and the price for this morning's casual cruelty would be paid in full. The storm, once set in motion, would not be silenced. Not this time. Naomi Sinclair sat motionless in a smooth, molded plastic chair against the far wall of Gate 24. Overhead, the speakers hummed with the usual rhythm of announcements, calling for final boarding for flights bound for destinations far from the sterile corridors of LAX. Her suitcase sat neatly at her feet, its gleaming leather surface a quiet testament to her status. A status that, in this place, was cast aside as easily as a random passenger on standby. But it was not the downgrade from first class to economy that filled her veins with a slow-burning decision. It was a network of whispered warnings and practical silence that enveloped the scene. She watched Chloe Patterson as she continued her duties at the gate, her plastic smile stretched thinner under the weight of her own prejudices. Naomi noticed the subtle exchanges of glances between the staff, the slight shifting of feet as passengers muttered about the problem at the counter. Even those who might have said something, who might have challenged the gate agent's brusque demeanor, chose instead to look away, their faces betraying their discomfort. The silence was a comfortable cocoon here, a barrier against the discomfort of admitting wrongdoing. A flight attendant named Grace passed her, her eyes flickering briefly to Naomi before she was distracted. She was young, her posture a little stiff, her stride quickened, as if distance from the scene might protect her from its effects. Naomi's eyes followed her, noting how even among those who recognized injustice, the pull toward silent submission was too strong. Grace's hands shook slightly as she adjusted the lapel of her uniform, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed. But Naomi saw it. She saw everything. Lucas, the junior staffer who had hesitated earlier, returned to the counter, his voice quiet as he spoke to Chloe. Naomi couldn't make out the words, but she read the tension in his posture, the slight frown that drew his brow together. His body language screamed reluctance, but his mouth moved in quick, clipped sentences, mouthing the apologies that had been drilled into him. Just following protocol, she imagined him saying, "That's what I was told to do." Chloe's response was a barely perceptible shake of the head, her lips pressed into the thin smile of someone who had already decided her role in the unfolding drama. Her voice rose slightly, the sweet saccharine covering the barbs of her disdain. "Just forget about it, Lucas. It's not worth it." Naomi felt the tension tighten in her chest. It wasn't just Chloe. It was the entire chain of whispered warnings and silent nods, the silent complicity that allowed the system to work with such ruthless efficiency. Even in plain sight, her presence, a silent protest against the treatment she had endured, did not stop the callous machine of compliance. Passengers avoided her gaze, stewards adjusted scarves and badges, and the line of travelers moved forward, eager to avoid the discomfort of confrontation. The woman across the aisle, a sharp-eyed, middle-aged traveler with a designer bag at her feet, stared at Naomi for a long moment before looking away. Her lips pressed into a thin line, a silent acknowledgement of something unfair. But her attention returned to her phone with a speed that spoke of self-preservation. It was not malice, Naomi realized. It was fear. The fear of being drawn into a situation that might threaten one's own comfort, one's own illusion of safety. The guards standing at the glass entrance to the terminal watched with impassive faces, their hands light on their belts. They had not been called to action not because there was no reason, but because the unfolding drama was shrouded in a silent submission that never reached the threshold of overt confrontation. Their presence was a visual deterrent, a reminder that power could be summoned with a look, a whisper, and that silence, when institutionalized, was as powerful as any command. Naomi's phone vibrated again. A hidden message appeared on the locked screen, its contents a silent signal from her assistant in the towering office she ran across continents. The message was truncated, but its meaning was clear. Preparations were underway. She inhaled slowly, letting the air settle deep in her lungs. Now was not the time to act. Not yet. She was gathering witnesses, patterns, evidence. The storm she would unleash would be born not of anger, but of precision, of the slow, careful weaving of truth into a weapon. Grace, the young stewardess, hesitated as she passed again. Her steps faltered, and for a moment she seemed about to pause, to say something, to offer the smallest sign of recognition. But her courage withered under the weight of professional etiquette and unspoken rules. She lowered her head, quickened her pace, her silence louder than any spoken word. Naomi followed her gaze briefly, then returned it to Chloe, who was now talking to a man in a formal business suit. His economy ticket clutched casually, his tone dripping with arrogance. Chloe laughed softly, too softly, and with a few quick keystrokes reassigned him to a better seat. Naomi noted every detail, the accidental reassignment, the preferential treatment, and filed it away like a lawyer preparing a smoking gun. The gate announced boarding was complete, voices soaring in artificial mirth as passengers gathered their bags and headed for the ramp. Naomi remained seated, her posture regal and unyielding, her presence an anchor in the tide of indifference. Even as the line thinned and the boarding agents prepared to close the doors, she did not move. She would not be erased so easily. Lucas returned to the counter, his shoulders slumped, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He glanced at Naomi once, guilt etched in his features, but said nothing. His silence was a confession, unspoken but deafening in its weight. Naomi met his gaze evenly, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. She did not need his words. She had seen enough. As the last passengers disappeared down the ramp and the terminal faded to a dull hum, Naomi stood slowly, gathering her coat with studied grace. She let them believe they had won this meeting. Let them think she had been pacified, released, sidelined. But they had miscalculated. They had mistaken silence for resignation, underestimating the quiet power that moved beneath the surface. Naomi's steps were measured as she approached the counter one last time. Chloe looked up, her smile fragile, her voice on the verge of a final platitude. But Naomi spoke first, her voice low, rich with the promise of something far more powerful than confrontation. "I hope you're ready," she said quietly, "because this story doesn't end at gate 24. And with that, she turned, walking away from the terminal that, only hours before, had tried to erase her presence. The whispered warnings and silent submissions that had conspired against her would soon crumble under the weight of their own complicity. They just didn't know it yet. The tension beneath the polished surface of the airport was more than a ripple. It was a crack, ready to split. By the time Naomi Sinclair's silhouette had disappeared from Gate 24, a quiet tremor had already begun its silent, irreversible spread. From a distance, the terminal continued its orderly dance of travel, the rhythmic hum of loudspeakers, the slap of suitcases on polished floors, the polite murmur of conversation. But closer, beyond the counters, beyond the stoic uniforms, beyond the electronic check-in, there was a distinct shift in atmosphere, a shift that signaled not just an incident, but the birth of a reckoning. Lucas, the junior employee who had tried, however feebly, to voice his discomfort, now felt himself being pulled inward. He returned to his small workstation behind the counter, his hands shaking as he reviewed reservation records and passenger manifests. His mind was not on the task before him, however. It was fixated on Naomi's quiet stoicism, her calm departure, and the hard realization of what had been set in motion. The systems Lucas had once trusted to be stable and fair were showing their cracks. His training had not prepared him for this moment, for the weight of complicity that now sat like a stone on his chest. Elsewhere in the terminal, Chloe Patterson's professional sheen was beginning to crumble at the edges. After Naomi left, she tried to resume her duties with mechanical precision, but her mind replayed the encounter in fragments. Naomi's calm voice, her unreadable gaze, the echo of her parting words. Every click of her keyboard seemed more brittle now. Every smile offered to passengers more forced. She had seen situations like this before, when such niceties as breathing went unchecked, but never before had she felt it bite back so quickly. Her laughter, her dismissive tone, her willingness to placate some passengers while ignoring others. Each was now a splinter, digging under her skin. Grace, the young flight attendant, stood at the far end of the terminal, her hands clasped in front of her. A shudder of regret passed through her like an aftershock. She had seen it all and done nothing. She had played her part in silent submission, in the pretense of professionalism. Now that silence felt suffocating. The sting of guilt was stronger than she had expected. Her thoughts went back to her first day at the airline, her naive joy, her pride in wearing the uniform. How easily she had allowed that pride to become a shield, a mask to hide her own discomfort in the face of injustice. Naomi's dignity had shattered that illusion. Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of the operations office, the shift supervisor, a wiry man named Dennis Marks, watched the screens with growing concern. The incident had not been officially recorded, but whispers were already filtering along the lines. The staff radio crackled with quiet conversations. The security men exchanged glances. The digital logs showed the seat reassignments and the rewrite codes, but no one had yet flagged it as a protocol violation. Not officially, but Dennis felt it weighing on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't just a disgruntled passenger making a scene. Threads were unraveling, the knots of the system tightening in ways he hadn't foreseen. Naomi, meanwhile, had reached the executive lounge, not as a guest but as an observer. She remained silent, phone in hand, scrolling through the private channels of her network. Messages flashed across the screen. Lawyers were sending messages from 3 time zones. Logistics experts were preparing statements. Travel consortiums were initiating a preliminary freeze on joint operations with the airline. Each message was a calculated move, a silent stone placed on a chessboard where every piece was underestimated. Naomi's face was impassive, but her thoughts pierced the false calm of the terminal like a scalpel. As the minutes passed, the surface order of the airport began to waver. Terminal screens froze briefly, causing passenger manifests to flicker unsteadily. The line at the check-in desk lengthened as Chloe fumbled with the manual reassignment of flights she had previously managed with ease. Lucas overheard snatches of conversations between executives, muttering concerns about system errors, about lapses in control. Chloe's hands visibly shook as she tried to maintain composure, but the weight of the accumulated errors weighed on her. She felt Naomi's shadow in every crack of the system, a presence she couldn't erase or ignore. Grace lingered at the ramp, glancing out of the corner of her eye at the boarding agents, as if waiting for some sign that someone would speak. Someone would talk about what had happened, but no one did. The silence deepened, thickening the air around her. It was then that she realized something Naomi had known all along. The real power of injustice wasn't in loud public acts of exclusion. It was in the quiet, almost invisible agreements, in the moments when people looked away, when rules were written to protect silence rather than truth. In the staff lounge, Dennis paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. He tried to contact his regional manager, but the line kept dropping. Messages went unanswered. Reports of unusual delays began to trickle in. Naomi's influence, though invisible, was now palpable. This wasn't just a legal threat from her company or the looming risk of bad press. It was a slow, insidious erosion of trust. Chloe, Lucas, Grace, they all felt the crack beneath the surface of their carefully maintained order. The silence that had once protected them was now their undoing. Naomi's departure was not a retreat. It was an earthquake, whose tremors were now radiating outward, destabilizing not just the gate, not just the terminal, but the entire foundation on which these silent injustices had been built. And as the cracks widened, the question hanging in the air was not whether the system would break. It was how soon and at what cost. As daylight stretched longer across the walls of Denver International Airport, the crack beneath its polished surface deepened. By mid-afternoon, systems that had once hummed with precision now trembled under the weight of hidden failures. Emails piled up in executive inboxes, urgent messages from regional offices went unanswered, and beneath it all, the growing realization that the quiet figure they had written off had never really left the terminal. Naomi Sinclair had simply changed her strategy. Behind the sterile walls of her private office in Denver's financial district, Naomi's legal team coordinated their efforts with a chilling calm. Their approach was neither loud nor reactionary. Instead, it unfolded with the same quiet force she had displayed in the terminal, a steady, targeted application of power. Calls were made to terminate contracts with airline-connected vendors. Meetings were quietly canceled, and entire blocks of premium bookings were frozen with one-line directives. No statements were made to the press. No press releases were prepared. The strategy was not public shaming. It was systemic accountability, executed with the precision of a scalpel. At the airport, Chloe Patterson found herself summoned to an urgent meeting in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the runways. She walked in clutching a notepad, her nerves on edge. Dennis Marks, the senior shift supervisor, sat across from her, his face tense and pale. Behind him, two men in dark suits, both from the airline's corporate security department, listened silently. "We need to understand what happened," one of them said, his tone measured but sharp. "Reassignments, security interventions, system overrides. Was there a mistake?" Chloe's voice wavered as she recounted the events. Naomi's approach, her boarding pass, the subtle smirks, the whispered jokes. As she spoke, fragments of complicity emerged like broken glass. Silent compliance, decisions made in whispers, small betrayals of honesty. But for the first time, Chloe's story wasn't defensive. There was a quiet regret to it that made her words vulnerable. "We were just following what we thought was normal," she murmured, "but we weren't thinking about what that meant." Outside the conference room, Grace lingered in the terminal's service corridor, her mind heavy with thought. She watched families gather at the gate, children clinging to stuffed animals, business travelers tapping anxiously on their phones. And amid the mundane scene, the weight of her silence grew heavier. She didn't speak. She chose comfort over courage. But Naomi's gaze, calm and implacable, haunted her. It was a reminder that silence was a special kind of complicity, and that atonement, if it were possible, would require more than quiet regret. In the operations center, Lucas leaned over his console, his heart pounding as he tracked the escalating system failures. Supplier codes were returning errors, boarding queues were being reassigned without approval, and priority systems were being flagged for internal review. He recognized Naomi's hand in those silent failures, not as vengeance but as an assertion of control. His hands shook as he realized how easily one undervalued person could change the balance of the entire system. By evening, the airport's executive core was bustling with activity. Naomi's quiet departure had escalated into a full-blown crisis. The compliance officers whispered behind closed doors, their voices tense with anxiety. Rumors swirled about Naomi's connections, her influence in elite travel networks, her company's links to international logistics partners. The realization came with chilling clarity. She was more than just a passenger. She was a key client whose quiet decisions could destroy entire pillars of their business. But there was resilience amid the toll, though not where most expected. Grace, a young flight attendant, called an impromptu meeting with her boss. She spoke softly but with new determination. "I have something to report," she said. She told of the timeline, of the whispered warnings, of the smirks across tables, of the way the silence had stifled justice. It wasn't an act of bravery born of innocence. It was a choice made in the wake of realization. Her report hadn't been conclusive, but it was a crack in the wall of complicity. Chloe, too, had found her own form of resilience. Alone in the break room after her report, she sat staring at her reflection in the scratched mirror. The weight of her actions pressed against her chest, but for the first time, she let it settle, rather than pushing it away. She opened her phone and wrote an email, not to HR, not to her manager, but to Naomi. She apologized not with flowery phrases or rehearsed platitudes, but with the raw, unvarnished truth. "I saw what we did, and I didn't stop it," she wrote. "I didn't speak up because it was easier not to. I'm sorry." Lucas, devastated by his own role in the spiraling events, did not send an apology. Instead, he filed a formal report with corporate outlining the systemic overrides, procedural lapses, and tacit approvals that had enabled discrimination. It was a dry document, factual and precise, but it was his attempt to replace silence with accountability. Naomi, for her part, watched these tremors from a quiet office as dusk streaked the Denver skyline with lavender and gold. She did not expect an apology. She did not need public remorse. Her attention remained focused on the bigger picture, restructuring relationships, recalibrating power, redefining resilience. This was not just about her own experience. It was about exposing a culture that thrived in silence. The reckoning as it unfolded was not a spectacle. It was a quiet dismantling, a loss of trust, a redistribution of power. For Naomi, this was not an act of revenge. It was an assertion of dignity, an insistence that resilience is not about overcoming injustice. It is about transforming herself. And as the polished corridors of the airport filled with nervous whispers and quiet calculations, Naomi remained calm. Because for her, true victory was never about reaction. It was about the quiet resilience of action that rewrote the rules entirely. Naomi Sinclair's car moved smoothly through the quiet streets of Denver. The city skyline slowly faded into the night behind her. The lights of the high-rise buildings shimmered against the deep blue sky, a sharp contrast to the turmoil that had raged beneath them just hours before. She sat silently, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, but her mind tracing the lines of what had happened. This was not simply the collapse of a failed system at the airport. This was the coming of awareness, the quiet reclaiming of control that had always been within her power. The events of the day were not about revenge or public spectacle. They were about truth, truth long ignored, long buried beneath polished facades and practiced smiles. Naomi's actions were deliberate, not because she sought chaos, but because she understood the power of measured resolve. She had allowed the system to expose itself, to unravel under its own weight. And now, as the city exhaled under the cover of night, she began to consider what would happen next. In her Denver office, the quiet hum of incoming emails and notifications had all but ceased. Legal teams had already filed the necessary revocations. Finance departments had closed accounts, and the systemic glitches she had initiated earlier in the day had evolved into quiet systemic recalibrations. Contracts were being renegotiated, and calls for damages were beginning to filter through corporate channels. But to Naomi, these were just formalities. She was already thinking about the immediate aftermath. The next chapter was not about returning to old structures or issuing statements that would satisfy the public's desire for resolution. Naomi understood the futility of apologies without accountability, assurances rendered empty by inaction. She envisioned something deeper, a transformation not just within her own organization, but across the broader network of stakeholder partners and communities she touched. She wasn't interested in showboating. She wanted change that was structural, permanent, and filled with honesty. The message she sent that evening was simple but unambiguous. It wasn't directed at the press, nor was it posted on social media for public consumption. It was a private message to her board, her core leadership team, and the key partners who had weathered the storms with her. Our responsibility, it began, is to create systems where dignity is the foundation, not a privilege, where silence is not a strategy, but an action, where every decision reflects the values we affirm. Effective immediately, all future partnerships will be reevaluated against this standard. Any that do not will be terminated, no exceptions. The weight of those words reverberated far beyond the walls of her office. They marked a shift not just in policy, but in philosophy, a declaration that Naomi was no longer willing to operate within a broken system. She was ready to build a new one that could not be so easily destroyed by bias disguised as bureaucracy, prejudice dressed up as professionalism. The following week, Naomi convened a private summit at a secluded retreat in the mountains outside of Boulder. She gathered her closest advisors, community leaders, and a few people from organizations that had proven their commitment to equity and justice. This was not a public event, and there were no stage photo ops. Instead, it was a place for honest conversation, for confronting uncomfortable truths, and forging a future not dictated by old norms, but shaped by new, inclusive realities. Around a large oak table, the conversations were frank and unvarnished. Stories were shared, some about failure, some about resilience. Plans were made not just to fix what was broken, but to replace it entirely. Naomi listened, contributed, and then, as the evening deepened, she spoke. Her voice was even, but there was a depth to it that silenced the room. The systems we build, she said, must be strong enough to resist bias, but flexible enough to correct it. They must be transparent, accountable, and built on a foundation of empathy. We are not here to fix the old. We are here to create the new. In the silence that followed, something shifted. It was not just one woman's determination, but the awakening of a collective understanding that change, real change, does not begin with policies or sanctions. It begins with the courage to reimagine the world as it should be and the determination to make it happen. Looking at faces that reflected determination, hope, and hard-won wisdom, Naomi felt something deeper than satisfaction. She felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would not be easy. It would require more moments of silence, more difficult decisions, and more unwavering commitment. But she was ready. The beginning of a new chapter was not marked by announcements or headlines. It was marked by a quiet gathering of resolve, the first steps in dismantling the old narrative and replacing it with a narrative written with dignity, equality, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Naomi Sinclair knew that her story was no longer hers alone. It was the story of everyone who was willing to stand with her, and the world they were determined to build. Naomi Sinclair's journey was more than a tale of resistance. It was a masterclass in resilience, a testament to the quiet but defiant power of honesty. What began with a look, a moment of silent disregard at a Denver airport check-in counter, unfolded into a symphony of calculated actions that tore apart a web of complacency and prejudice. Naomi, a woman of unwavering grit and vision, did not raise her voice in anger. Instead, she wielded her power with precision, turning the very system that sought to humiliate her into a reflection of her own shortcomings. Through her calm, calculated exit from the Coleman Global Partnership and strategic reassessment of alliances, she demonstrated that true strength often lies not in confrontation, but in quiet, uncompromising resolve. The narrative was not about revenge, but about justice, about reclaiming a dignity that transcended personal grievances and reverberated in corporate hallways and public halls. Naomi's choice to confront implicit biases and systemic failures, not with rage but with structured, effective action, forced not just an organization, but an entire ecosystem to reflect on its shortcomings. She proved that silence, when chosen wisely, can speak louder than any scream. It was a silence that demanded attention, that disrupted the comfortable rhythms of those complicit in the status quo. This story holds a mirror up to our own lives. The lesson of Naomi's experience is clear and profound. Real change begins with refusing to accept the unacceptable, with the courage to stand firm in the face of systemic injustices. It's about understanding that while the world may reject you through subtle biases or overt discrimination, your value and your voice remain intact. Naomi's strategy for leaving toxic partnerships while laying the groundwork for equitable systems offers a roadmap for anyone who feels powerless in the face of injustice. Whether in corporate boardrooms, government agencies, or personal relationships, the principle remains the same. Honesty coupled with strategic action can change even the most entrenched dynamics. For each of us, the lesson of this story calls for self-reflection and courage. It calls us to identify where we may be silently complicit in systems that exclude or degrade others. It calls us to enter into moments where our quiet, decisive actions can rewrite narratives not through conflict, but through clarity and an unwavering commitment to justice. Whether it's standing up for a colleague, reevaluating our business partnerships, or calling out power in our communities, the impact of these choices is profound. If Naomi Sinclair's story has touched you, if it has inspired you to reimagine what resilience and strength can truly look like, then please join us. Subscribe to our channel to keep the conversation going. Your support not only enables more stories like Naomi's, but also strengthens a growing community committed to justice, equality, and effective change. Let's stand together, not just to listen, but to lead. Let's make sure stories like these are not only heard, but lived.